And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you a friend of mine, a friend that I met almost 7 years ago now. I was just starting my year as governor of this district, and there was a process going on to name a Rotary Peace Fellow, someone that was applying through a Rotary grant to learn peace, give peace a chance. Rotary has a huge commitment toward this. Only 50 people are chosen. Master's degree or another kind of degree, and there are 5 or 6 universities in the world that these people can matriculate through, and Chris was chosen by our district and then chosen by Rotary International and the Rotary Foundation to be and to learn the pathways of peace. Chris comes from a background where peace wasn't an option. Born in South Sudan, he endured things that none of us want to, and left at a young age of approximately 11, I think. Refugee camps. Finally made its way to the U.S. And when you look at your Rotarizonian, look at what he's accomplished. And throughout all of that, he took the time out of his life to make peace a priority. Today, his group, the Zambakari group, studies this and other issues related to world problems, particularly in Africa. So today, I want you to meet my friend, Rotary Peace Fellow, Dr. Chris Zambakari.
Yes. Oh my. Never turn down the music. Every time Governor Wilson introduces me, he always brings up the salsa. And I always tell people you can make a lot of peace. You can do a lot of peace through dance, because music is a universal language. It doesn't matter where you go. Music speaks to people in ways that is very difficult to fathom and understand. So if we can build peace by engaging more of the arts, I think that would be a great thing. Salsa aside, it's a huge honor for me to be here for a couple of reasons. This club, the history of this club, over 100 years of living the Rotary motto, service above self. And if you look at, or if you follow the social media for this club, or the YouTube videos that Craig Wilson posts, which I have the privilege of watching every time they go up, and I get a notification that says a new video is up, you'll see that this club, if you look at the members, you look at the projects it's undertaken around the world, South America, in Africa, in Asia, it's quite impressive. But also, if you look at who spoke at this club, right? Former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, the president of one of the largest universities in the United States, Michael Crow, Kate Gallego, the mayor of Phoenix, and many, many, many more. So it is a huge honor for me to be here. But I also want to thank the Reverend, the doctor, the mother, who traveled very far to come and hear me, Dr. Janet Gould. So thank you. If it wasn't for Janet and Bob, I don't think I will be standing here today as a former Peace Fellow. So They said a journey of 1,000 miles began one step. That was the one step that kind of set everything else in motion. With that said, when I thought about what I wanted to share with you, and the fact this club is so impressive, that most people here are industry leaders, you're all very accomplished, I thought one of the things that we could sort of think about, meditate on, is the issues of the cost of violence and the business of peace. I like the concept of the business of peace, because there's a business of this and there's a private sector of that, but really there should be more talk about the business of peace. Let me see if my slides are up. Perfect. And I want to highlight what it costs everybody, you, me, us, the global economy, what violence really costs us, because I think it's important to keep that in mind when we make the case for peace. And then I'll go over some of the projects that we've done through the Zambakari Advisory and the impact of those projects around the world. But first I have a short story. The year was 1987, 1988, South Central America, Nicaragua. Nicaragua had been going through a vicious revolution and a counter-revolution, basically a very massive civil war. And the conflict itself had sort of local, regional, and because it was the height of the Cold War, you also had an international component to it. So a group of American church leaders became involved in this conflict as mediators and facilitators. And one gentleman on that team goes by the name of John Paul Lederach. He's a household name in the study of peace and conflict transformation. The idea that it's not enough to simply sign agreements and say, you know what, we may not be killing each other today, we can coexist, but that you have to transform the relationship of the society where conflict has taken place. So John was in Costa Rica. He had a 3-year-old daughter. His wife was there, because shuttling between San Jose and the deep jungles of Nicaragua, between warring factions. And one evening, he gets a phone call. And on the other end of the phone call was a trusted friend. He said, John, I have some difficult news. I don't know how to break it to you, but I hope you're sitting. I've been informed by a very good source that there's a plan to kidnap your daughter. You have to tell your wife to break all her routine. Make sure you don't open the door. She cannot go to school tomorrow. The threat is very serious. Essentially, there's an attempt to kidnap your daughter, kill her for political gain. And obviously, being a parent, she was just floored by this phone call. So the first question I have for you is, the same question that he asked himself was, peace is a noble pursuit. Peace is a very noble pursuit, but at what price? I like to phrase it this way. What is the cost of peace? And if you were in his shoes, and you got this call, this midnight hour call, what would you do? So, with that said, there's been a systematic attempt by two of the top organizations in this field. Brown University, which has studied the cost of U.S. foreign wars post 9/11, in terms of financial cost, in terms of social cost, in terms of economic cost, human lives, how many people have paid the ultimate price to defend this country. And then another study by an organization that has now partnered with Rotary International. It's the Institute for Economics of Peace. And they work a lot with the Rotary Peace Fellows. And they publish what is known as the Global Peace Index. And they've tried to systematically count on a conservative estimate what does it cost, you, me, us. And they said last year, almost $15 trillion was consumed by the problems of violence. Or you can think of it as 12% of the global GDP. Or better yet, $2,000 per capita. And you can understand from sort of this statistic, and every year it goes up, almost by half to $1 trillion every year. So it's more and more expensive, the cost that we all have to pay for the problems of violence. I'm not going to get into details about how much we put toward prevention and conflict resolution around the world, because that number is very, very small. So Rotary, which has a long history with making peace and building peace and other international programs around the world, began to formalize a program to train peacemakers, essentially leaders in peace building, because the certificate program trains mid-level professionals, whereas the Peace Fellowship, the Ambassadorial Fellowship, prior to that, trains young and emerging scholars that go on to build peace in the respective corners of the world. And Governor Wilson was talking about the peace centers around the world. You can see them on the map. Duke and Chapel Hill, University of Bradford in the UK, Christian University in Tokyo, Chulalongkorn in Thailand, the University of Queensland, where I was based. And there is talks within Rotary that in the coming years, they're trying to expand the certificate program because it's so successful that they're looking at each region of the globe to have its own center so that it can respond more adequately, rapidly to changing events in the region. So I think that's great news. And we should welcome this development from Rotary. I became even more interested in how Rotary was spending its resources. Because when we talk about the business of peace, everyone that has managed an organization, that has started a business, led a business, understand that behind a very successful business is a very successful vision, right? And we know that where there is no vision, the people generally perish, as the saying goes. So a good vision, a good business plan, and behind that good business plan, you need resources, be it money, be it staff, volunteers, whatever it is, you need resources, and you need a good strategy. And if you look at the issues that Rotary has taken on board, right, at the very top is the issue of disease prevention, number one, in terms of money that is invested in it. But it's not a surprise. Most of you here should not be surprised by this number, because one of the flagship programs in that category is the anti-polio campaign. As you heard today, polio has been reduced systematically down to 3 places in the world. And I'll drop a little hint. There's a reason why those 3 places have kind of stayed where they have. The word is peace. There's a relationship between that work and how stable, peaceful the region is. You cannot just go and immunize people in an ongoing violent context. So there's a relationship there. In the second place, something that is very dear to Governor Wilson over the years, the water projects in Kenya and around the world. Economic development, basic literacy, maternal child health, and peace and conflict. This is intriguing. I have looked at this chart for a very long time. And then as I was traveling at the same time around the world, I began meeting more and more of the peace scholars. Rotary has now trained 1,200 of these fellows over the last decade. So you find them spread out literally around the world. The question has become, what do these people do? What do they do? Rotary began studying and assessing and collecting data on what the fellows were doing. Turns out, most of them go on to the NGO sector, which is not a surprise. And many of them go on to work for government agencies. Also not a big surprise, because they're pulled from such diverse sectors and industries that they go back usually to those same sectors and industries and do what needs to be done to build peace. And as you look, research and academics, the United Nations, police and law enforcement. One of my colleagues was a senior law enforcement officer in Sao Paulo, for example. And I had another friend, a colleague of mine, who was in the US Army captain. And the World Bank. So what is intriguing about this is that what Rotary pays, what your money, what the money that comes from the clubs, that goes into the peace program, what it really pays for are people that go on to systematically contribute to all the Rotary causes. I think Rotary calls them causes. So every dollar that goes into the peace program really produces individuals that go on to contribute to just about every single one of the Rotary programs in the world. Right? I think that's a terrific business model. If you could put $1 in a program that's going to multiply indefinitely throughout society, we'll say that's a tremendous investment. That's a great investment. If I was speaking to church, I would say, can I get a witness? Can I get an amen? Because that deserves an amen. So it's been, in fact, if you look at the partnership between the Gates and Melinda Foundation and Rotary, which has really precipitated the process of eradicating polio, right? You think the Gates and Melinda Foundation without Microsoft, there's a relationship, Microsoft, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and then the partnership with Rotary that has driven polio to the verge of total eradication. So the public-private partnership, if it's done adequately, if it's done well, I think it holds the secret to doing even more for the world in terms of peace and even beyond. Even beyond. And so when I began my program at the University of Queensland, part of the program was what the Rotary calls an applied field experience, where you're actually sent to work with an organization for several months. I went to Germany. As I was telling Governor Wilson earlier, I very much love Germany. And my experience there was one of the highlights of the program for me, because I got a chance to basically be embedded within a leading German foundation working on transitional processes. North Africa, Yemen, throughout the Middle East, the Sudanese delegation. I mean, you name it. We were right up there. I was doing a lot of the analysis for them and going to meetings with foreign ministers to study what they were doing, because Germany had basically become this country where a lot of the peace brokering takes place. And Lederach, that I told you earlier about, developed what he called the Lederach pyramid of peace building. It's interesting because in recent time, there's a lot of talk about what's the role of the private sector in building peace. So Lederach came out with this pyramid by stratifying the different layers and tiers in society. You can think of them as the different ways to go about building peace. And at each level, you have essentially small, mid-sized, large, at the very top, big businesses, and other actors that all are networked, that all are embedded in society. So if you're to leverage the resources that these people have, you can do 10, 20, maybe 30 times more toward peace than what we're doing right now. And it's also interesting when we talk about business and peace building to know a few things that we not know empirically about the private sector and what peace mean for the economy. Because I think it matters to know these things, because otherwise we're looking at peace as just some altruistic thing that we do, but that really doesn't bring a return on that investment. IEP, the Institute for Economics of Peace, tells us, for example, that countries that improve in the level of peace, the level of peacefulness, had 7 times higher GDP growth rate than countries that didn't. Think about that. Because most of us here will not put our resources and money in a country that was falling apart, a country that was undergoing violence. And we've done a lot of work in Africa. I can tell you right now, foreign direct investment are not going to flow into a country if there are massive civil war, human rights violation taking place, and you're basically on the other side of history. It's not going to happen. People want to know that their investment is secure, the institutions are good, that you're not going to lose all your investment because some demagogue took power and drove everybody out of office. So there is a relationship between growth domestic product and how peaceful a country is. But more specifically, peaceful countries also receive the equivalent of 2% increase in their GDP accounted for by FDI, foreign direct investment. That's 2%. So improving peace, you improve the likelihood of attracting a foreign direct investment. And so it got me thinking, if we can increase corporate effort, right? Because at all levels, you have private sector actors. If you can increase, even by 1%, their involvement in peace building, really, we can elevate society at all levels up. And so when I came back from Australia, I founded the advisory. And one of the things we've tried to do is to really sit at the nexus of peace and conflict studies, development. I like to consider myself a Hamiltonian in how I think. I say a Hamiltonian because ever since I was resettled in the United States and I learned about Alexander Hamilton. How many people here Alexander Hamilton? Thank you. I think everybody needs to know about Alexander Hamilton. Everybody, like from age 1 all the way up. Not how things ended for him, but the legacy of Hamilton. So when I got a chance years ago to visit and tour the U.S. Supreme Court, the White House, you can imagine I was like, I got to go see the section dedicated to this man, the first Treasury Secretary of the United States. And for those of you that might be curious, the U.S. Treasury is the only federal institution that shared the lawn directly with the White House. I don't think that's a coincidence, right? I don't think it's a coincidence at all. But Hamilton so deeply believed in economic sovereignty in the U.S. central bank. He's the godfather of the Federal Reserve, if you will. And the U.S. system, economic system, was in many ways theorized by Hamilton. And Hamilton argued, unless you develop the infant industries, the productive powers, what he called the productive powers of the United States, you're not going to rival the British Empire. You're not going to, because Great Britain was so far ahead in advance. So I deeply believe that in building peace, you also have to look at prosperity. And those two things go hand in hand. Why a lot of times when you have good trading relationship with a country, it kind of reduces the likelihood that you go into conflict with these people. There are some exceptions, but generally, the more of a trading partner you have with someone, the better the relationships are. And we know that private sector actors are highly networked within society, and those relationships produces dividend, and they also produce peace dividend. So the advisory began by looking at cases in Africa. We began by looking at countries and industries that are involved in Africa and in different parts of Africa. In the Eastern Congo, one of the wealthiest, richest countries on the planet in terms of raw material, and vicious conflict taking place in that country. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people dead. The country split, essentially, controlled by warlords in different parts. But amidst that conflict, in Eastern Congo emerged a commerce group, a group of entrepreneurs that were trading inside of that war zone, trading with the region. And the network they built, the road system that they put in place, the schools that they funded, have had actually an impact of stabilizing that region. And this, to me, is very interesting. It's very intriguing because these are agencies and entrepreneurs that have tremendous amount of resources, and they're able to use these resources to actually improve the livelihood of the people around them. Take Nigeria, one of the countries where polio is still an issue. Some of the studies that we've done looked at developing predictive models, look at economic growth in parts of Nigeria, because Nigeria is a huge oil-producing country. But in parts of Nigeria, oil has actually fueled conflict in part of that country. In the northern part, you also had a crisis there, a mini civil war. In the southern part, same thing. The question has become, what are the implications of this instability on economic development, foreign direct investment, FDI, and so forth and so forth. So developing models that looked at those factors, as well as the level of peace and stability in the country for actors and agencies that are interested in working with Nigeria or even investing in Nigeria, became something that was very, very important. And this year alone, we also produced a series of studies that we put together a team of experts on South Sudan. That's where I was from, and I wanted to do something that could contribute to the ongoing peace negotiation in the country. So I basically put together, it took us about a year to actually pull it off together. I wanted this expert to tell us how we got into the mess, what to do about this mess, and how to come out of this mess. So we produced our first special issue on peace building, peacemaking, and peace agreement in South Sudan. And this research, in the first month it was released, has been circulated to nearly 750,000 people. And so emails started coming in, and people wanted parts of that to use in training. And that made me really proud because it meant we were developing tools and instruments, trainings and research, producing evidence-based research that went straight into building peace, contributing to generating awareness about the issues that were affecting the country. So the 4 areas we produce a lot of research on, we do a lot of forecasting, research, we do collection, we triangulate data, we collect our own, but we also secure data from other sources. We clean this data, analyze it, triangulate it, meaning putting it all together, and then run analysis on different parts of the world. And increasingly, we're also looking at developments here in Phoenix, because we're based in Phoenix. And I want us to also be locally relevant. So I began meeting with a wide range of actors. And the issues of sexual violence against people with disability was a big issue because of the Hacienda debacle, and DDD, the Division of Disability, wanted to do something about this stuff. And I thought, oh my God, we have developed tools and instruments in studying this issue overseas. If we use the same analytic tools and study, we could actually contribute to making the state of Arizona stronger, better, more efficient at protecting those that are the most vulnerable among us. So those are some of the areas in which we publish extensively, as well as political analysis. I think this is common sense, because what happens in the country politically affects what happens in the country economically, socially, and so forth. So understanding the dynamic on the ground and looking at data that is increasingly being pulled, because technology has made it easy for us to collect data in parts of the world that you wouldn't want to be, we're able to provide unique insights into what's happening in different parts of the world. And next year, we are looking at the growing influence of China in Africa. And for those of you in international trade, you know that China's footprint on the continent has dramatically increased. Over the last decade, I think China surpassed the EU in simple trade and relation with Africa. What are the implications for that burgeoning relationship? What implications does it have for peace building on the continent? And what does it imply, what implications does it have for American businesses that are also looking at competing in different parts of the continent? So we're going to be looking at that issue between now and next year, as well as Somalia. We produce a lot of studies on Somalia. And again, in Somalia, very interesting, the one agreement that was signed that stabilized Somalia briefly was engineered by the Somali business sector. The leaders, business leaders in Somalia basically said, war is not good for us. And they said, we got to do something about this because it's not good for us. So looking at this kind of relationships where you have private sector actors, by the way, Somalia is not the only case. Tunisia, the transition in Tunisia, it was allowed and enabled primarily by the professionals associations. They underwrote the agreement and they pulled the warring faction in and said, you've got to fix this stuff. And it worked. And right now, the development in Sudan, same thing there. It was the Doctors Association, the Lawyers Association that basically said, enough. Bashir, you've been in power for 30 years. This is the end of the road for you. And it set in motion a series of events that we're hoping will bring democracy to a country where democracy has long been a fleeting concept for decades and decades. So these relationships, we look at how to develop them, how to build better partnership that in the end produces better dividend for peace. And so we've also done a lot of training for corporations that are looking at different parts of Africa, looking at investing. You see them on the left. But also, really what makes me really proud is that the African Union, IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, a block of 8 trading nations in East Africa, has retained several of our research and tools in their library as resources, key resources in understanding and making sense of evolving dynamics on the continent. And that also includes, among others, the United Nations Economic for Africa. And to do all of this in basically 5 years, I think was quite remarkable with the resources that we had at our disposal. But I want to end on a more positive, maybe by posing a question to everybody in here. As I told you earlier, actually, let me backtrack. So, someone here might be thinking, well, what happened to John Paul Lederach? What happened to him? You opened with him, but what happened to him? There was a sort of good news and bad news. The good news is he got the wife and the kid out of the country. And he told himself, I have to stay and see this through. He nearly died. He got attacked by one of the warring factions, beaten severely, and nearly died. But he stayed. Right? As in any conflict, you're always going to find people that try to spoil the peace process. But he stayed. Nicaragua had an agreement that paved the way to stabilize that country. And I think Lederach's legacy lives on in Nicaragua to this day. The same way Hamilton's legacy looms large over this country and everybody that trades and do business in this country. So the question I have for everybody in here is, what will be your legacy? If you were to leave today, would you stand here or sit here and say, I came, I did what I was supposed to do while I was here, I ran the race, I finished the race, and I kept the faith? And what do you want your legacy to be for those that comes after you? Because in many ways, I've come to realize we are where we are today primarily because of what came before us. And the folks that came before us did things or didn't do things, it sometimes goes both ways, that resulted in where we are today. Then the question becomes, what kind of world do we want to build for those that come after us? Thank you.
Hello? Oh, there we go. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it very much. I have a question. If y'all have questions, just line up. When I was looking at your presentation and listening to you, my question is about the research that you do, the fact-based research, and working with local law enforcement agencies. Can you give an example of that, of how that works, what you do in that area?
So when you're dealing with fast-changing facts on the ground, one of the things that is very scarce is data that comes from the field, data that you can analyze and look at trends and say, well, these are the factors that contribute to X, Y, and Z. And for the last decade, one of the things that I've done since I was in grad school was to look at collecting data, generally UN data as well as data that we collected ourselves, and to develop predictive models that looked at what were the likelihood, for example, that someone will die from kidnapping or from gun violence or from a million different factors, and then to empirically test those models against data that was coming from the field. And for agencies that were interested in building peace in different parts of the world, you could tell them, for example, that region A, B, C, and D have this axis of violence. And if you're interested in bringing resources or aid to that region, really, these are the actors, these are the people that are driving the violence, because we're able to sort of analyze them and tabulate them. You need to engage with these people. And when it comes time to bring people together on a table, you also want to know who the major stakeholders are. Because if you go in there and you impose your model, and the people are saying, well, no, which happened in Somalia a lot. We came in and we imposed, and then it didn't work because we never understood the clan system in the region, but it fell apart. But the moment we start understanding that this is a society that is driven and based on a clan system, then you're like, okay, these are the people you need to bring to the table because they're major stakeholders in that society. We've also looked at cases in Libya. Libya also another country going through a tremendous amount of violence. We looked at who were the major stakeholders in the different part of Libya, and if you were interested in brokering peace, the first thing you needed to do was to understand, first of all, the landscape of what's happening in that country and who's driving it and what are the costs involved in the activities taking place in that country. So we do a lot of quantitative analysis, a lot of predictive models. We develop these models to help decision makers understand the context they're getting ready to get involved in. And I think in the long term, it cut cost, it allows you to avoid mistakes, but also it keeps you out of the loop. Because one of the things that happened in the Eastern Congo was a lot of the extractive industries, people that were mining there, basically had to pay off some of these warlords in order for them to mine. But then what it did was it just sustained the conflict. Because now they were paying these resources, and they'll say, well, you do whatever you do with your money. But it turns out these people were basically buying even more arms. And so now we're talking about maybe we need to put an embargo to block the sales of armament, something very difficult to do because there's always somebody out there willing to sell you firearms, to these actors that were doing a lot of havoc in the region. So one of the things we seek to do is to provide this sort of timely analysis that is ever evolving, because data comes in, we run it, we see, okay, so the configuration of the actor has changed. So instead of you talking to this person, you need to make sure you talk to that person. That may not be obvious at first sight. So, and we did it through a lot of data analysis and triangulating very vast data.
Thank you, Doctor.
Appreciate you being here, and in honor of your presentation, we'd like to give you this certificate. We've made a donation in your name to Mark Community Resources, Inc. They provide educational, therapeutic, rehabilitative, and social services to children and adults with developmental and physical disabilities and behavioral health challenges.
Oh my God.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.